Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of my target demographic. Those of you who are familiar with my work, and really who isn't, will know that many of my stories can be long and heavy in multi-textured shades of gray, like the prominent proboscis of the ponderous pachyderm. The first piece I'd like to present for you this evening, to maintain that mammalian metaphor, is little more than a bit or two of gerbil fuzz, a beat or two of verbal jazz, a twist of the wit, a trick of the tongue, a tantalizing taste of linguistic terpsichore. Call it a pithy parcel of prosodic prestidigitation, if you will. And if you won't, you're a bunch of anti-semantic bastards. This is the story of the world's stupidest mugging, of which I was a victim when I was 22 years old. I had moved to Los Angeles in early 1986 and had been searching for parking ever since. When my sister contacted me from the East Coast, she was going to be speaking at Columbia University and invited me to come back to see her show. You'll have to forgive me, I will throughout the show be doing this. When I perform, I sweat like Chris Christie putting on his socks. So I made a trip back to the East Coast. Ronald Reagan was president, though he did not know it at the time. And I took the opportunity to visit all of my family while I was there. I started with a trip down to New Jersey to see my grandmother. The last time my grandmother was actually able to recognize me. She still knew me. She knew my name. She knew where I was, but every time she saw me, she thought it was my birthday and gave me $5. So that was exhausting to deal with. Had to keep walking in and out of that room. But before I go any further, let me just say that that is not a self-loathing anti-Semitic joke about a cultural relationship with money that values it over basic human decency. It's a self-loathing anti-capitalist joke about a societal relationship with money that values it over human decency. There's a place in the Alzheimer's decline, for those of you who have never dealt with a relative doing this, where it is just damned entertaining. So every conversation was a surreal television game show. It's just, I went into that place with the buildings and the smell, Manhattan, yes! I was with that lady with the terrible taste in clothing, Aunt Sarah, no! Bad breath, insufferably long, boring stories, your best friend Katie, yes! We saw that man. I need more clues. He's horrible, pass. No, you know this, he used to be horrible in New York, and then he was horrible all over the country, and now he's horrible from space. Howard Stern, yes! Congratulations, Grandma, you're going on to the dementia pyramid. Who are you people? Things you say at dinner. Where am I? Things you shout from the bathroom. Ed Asner, Benjamin Netanyahu, people you mistake for your ex-husband. I know people hear me do these jokes and they say, oh, that's tragic. You shouldn't do jokes about that. It's tragic. It was my grandmother who told me. We are Jews. We do not believe in tragedy. We believe in horror, atrocity, and injustice. We recognize them all as inherently hilarious. Of course, you know, she also said we must never forget, so. I remember when I was a kid, at one point at Thanksgiving dinner, I said, Grandma, next summer I'm going to camp, I'm going to ride horses, I'm going to play guitar. And she said, really? I went to a camp once. Spent 9 months of my life in a yard with the gypsies and the queers playing liar's poker. Pair of threes. My grandfather, ever willing to put horror under laughing glass, picked up the joke, stepped in, said, that's when I fell in love with her. Do you know how sharp you have to be to win with the same numbers every day? Besides, I always liked skinny girls. You want it darker? I'll put out the flame. He said, I saw her across the yard. I thought, my God, her tights are loose. Then I realized she wasn't wearing tights. This is my grandfather's ring that I wear, and my wife wears my grandmother's wedding ring. It was the most romantic night of our marriage, the night that we went out together, dug up my grandparents and stole their jewelry. So I finished that trip down to New Jersey, and then I went all the way up to Boston to see my parents in Boston. And my mother at that point had just become aware of the genetic crapshoot she was facing. She said, Dylan, you have to promise me that you will tell me when I start to show symptoms so I know when it's time to take my own life. I said, Mom, we just had this conversation 20 minutes. On the way down here tonight, I was listening to the Mountain Goats album, Tallahassee, and it had just spun around to the song Slow West Vultures when I pushed the button on my steering wheel that turns off the music and answers the phone, even though I have caller ID and could see that it was my mother. And after the conversation had gone on longer that I was comfortable with, which is to say, we had exchanged greetings, and we're still on the phone. She said, I hope I'm not interrupting anything. And I said, no, I was just listening to the Mountain Goats. And she said, oh, I thought you were in your car. And I said, I am in my car, Mom. And she said, ooh, why are there mountain goats in your car? And I said, it's a recording, Mom. And she said, oh, I don't get that California New Age thing where people listen to a record of nature sounds, a field of crickets, a pod of whales, whatever. And I said, no, Mom, it's a band. She said, honey, I'm pretty sure if it's whales, it's a pod. And she said it in that tone of forced patience and condescension with which she corrected me on my grammar when I was 5. And I said, not the whales, Mom, the mountain goats. And she said, oh, that would be a herd, dear. That tone. I guess I gripped my steering wheel and I listened to my breath, and I imagined a bird carrying my rage toward a distant horizon, as my therapist has advised me to do when my mother calls. I said, no, Mom, the Mountain Goats are a band. They play musical instruments and sing post-grunge humanist folk rock. She said, oh, that sounds very interesting. I would like to hear that. I said, I will send you a CD. She said, please don't. I would not enjoy it. I was just being polite. And then after this very brief pause, she said, can they even know what it's about? And I said, who? And she said, these mountain goats. Can they even know what the songs mean? I said, Mom, do you genuinely believe that the conversation we're having right now is actually about mountain goats that have been trained to play musical instruments and sing post-grunge humanist folk rock? She said, oh, Dylan, you're just like your father. It's always all about the subtext. I gripped my steering wheel and I listened to my breath, and she could hear the tension over the phone because I'm just like my father and it's always all about the subtext. She said, are you okay? Where did you just go just then? I said, I'm fine, Mom. I was just imagining a whole flock of crows headed toward a distant horizon. She said, oh, you're thinking of a murder, dear. And I said, yes. I don't learn not to answer the phone. Last December, she came to visit me, and she called me from her rental car to say, I think I may be lost. And I said, do you know where you are? And she said, not entirely. And I said, I think you may be right. She said, I got directions from LAX to your place from the Google. I said, Google? She said, okay, I'm on 405. I said, the 405. She said, why are you repeating everything I said? I said, so far so good. Are you going north or are you going south? She said, that's what I'm not sure about. It was late afternoon. So I said, is the sun to your right or to your left? She said, I don't see how that's going to help. I said, well, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. She said, I learned that in orienteering camp when I was a child. But that's for when you're lost in the woods. I said, well, it works on the freeway too. Is the sun to your right or to your left? She said, no, it's still not going to help. I said, why not? She said, because I don't want to go east or west, I want to go north. I said, Mom, if the sun is to your left, you are going north and you're going the right way. She said, are you sure you can figure it out from just one thing like that? Don't you need to triangulate? I said, only if I am trying to find the source of your radio signals during World War II. Wait, doesn't this phone have GPS on it? She said, it does. I don't like to turn it on. I don't want the NSA to know where I am. I said, I think it would be good if someone knew where you are. Is the sun to your right or to your left? It rises in the east. It sets in the west. She said, that can't be right, because orienteering camp was in June and it's the middle of winter now. I said, and yet the planet only spins the one direction. She said, then I don't understand how seasons work. I said, well, the Earth's axis of rotation is not directly perpendicular to its plane of revolution. She said, I don't know what that means. I said, it means the seasons work and the planet only spins the one direction. She gasped as though she had had an epiphany and said, clockwise. I said, well, that depends on which pole you're seeing it from. She said, are you telling me that south of the equator, the planet turns the opposite way? I said, Mom, I promise you, at every moment of every day, every point on the surface of the Earth, with the exception of the precise axillary poles, is moving from the west toward the east. She said, what happens when they get there? I said, then they hatch a plot to murder the President of the United States. She said, why would you say such a terrible thing? I said, because I want the NSA to listen to this call. I need a witness. She makes me nuts. At one point, she kept asking my wife when we were going to have kids, and it was so annoying to my wife that I finally had to step in and say, Mom, we are not going to have kids because I do not like children. And my mother said, oh, you get that from me. She thought we were going to bond over it. And we do not have kids. My wife and I live at the confluence of the mighty 118 and the majestic 210 freeways. It's not a crap neighborhood. It is crap neighborhood adjacent. I share a small townhouse apartment there with my two dogs, Sir Corwin, the beautiful dog-faced dog, Brindle, Beast of Silmar, and the new puppy, Ursa Minor, pup of 1,000 adjectives, little Bear Brody, Esquire, and my beautiful, beautiful wife, whose name escapes me at the moment. And because we live in a townhouse, we walk the dogs beyond the confines of the townhouse complex, where our neighbors have actual houses with actual lawns. I clean up after them when they relieve themselves, because I'm a nice guy. My dogs, not my neighbors. Not that nice a guy. My dogs have a favorite lawn. Yesterday morning, little Bear Brody, Esquire, demanded a walk. And I put him on his leash, and he led me directly to his favorite lawn. But apparently, the property on which that lawn resides has recently changed ownership. So the new owner of the house came out and said, that's my lawn. Now, I don't like the passive-aggressive guess my intent game. Moreover, my dogs have loved that lawn far longer than he has owned the home. So we feel a sense of entitlement. We have, as it were, squatters' rights. So rather than engaging him in an argument, I simply responded in kind and said, "That's my dog." He said, "That's my lawn." I said, "That's my dog." He stepped toward me, getting louder and angrier and clearer, and said, "That's my lawn." I considered restating ownership of the dog, but I was beginning to fear that he might actually think there was something wrong with me. So I took a different tack. And for the record, tack is the correct word here. It's an idiomatic sailing term. It refers to a navigational technique whereby the sails may be set so as to travel in a direction not parallel to the prevailing wind. My point is, if you have been saying take a different tact, people like me have been judging you harshly. I went a different way. I said, "I'm sorry, I don't speak English." He said, "You gotta be kidding me." I said, "No, seriously, I don't speak any English at all." He said, "But we're speaking English right now." I said, I realize this can be confusing. I've learned several words and phrases phonetically. I'm told I have a pretty good ear for accents. The result is an ability to create an illusion of fluency, conversationalism even. But the fact of the matter is, I have no idea what either of us have been saying throughout this entire exchange. While I offered up this little diatribe, Little Bear hunched up like a tiny kangaroo and relieved himself on the man's lawn. I collected the excrement in a plastic bag because I try to be a nice guy, and stepped toward the man saying, "If you want this, I won't have it bronzed." He pointed vaguely off toward his trash cans. I said, "I'll just throw it out in the trash over here then." And he stepped forward and raised a finger and announced, as though he actually felt he had won something in this exchange, "I knew you spoke English. I knew it, I knew it, I knew it." So I matched his inflection, his tone, and his gesture and listed English words that should be Yiddish but aren't. I said, "Moisenhassel, Castlefelt, spatula, spatula, spatula." Threw out the refuse and went home. A few hours later, Sir Corwin, the beautiful dog-faced dog, brindled east of Silmar, demanded a walk. I put him on his leash. He led me directly to the most favored lawn. The man saw a different dog on his lawn. Corwin is a striking beast. His father was a 210-pound brindled Neapolitan Mastiff, and his mother was history's most satisfied pug. The man came tearing out of his house and then realized I was that same guy and froze in his tracks. So I grinned at him like we were old friends about to engage in our favorite game and said, "That's my dog." And he said, "I am actually beginning to think there is something wrong with you." Went back inside. So apparently that's the tack I should have taken to begin with. But I digress. I may do that this evening. So I visited my parents. My dad, that was a good visit with my dad. My dad was the associate provost for the arts at MIT for 10 years, or as most people pronounce it, arts at MIT. A perfect job for him at the intersection of art and science there. While I was there, I got to see his production of the Heisenberg Uncertainty Opera, an epic musicale during which it's possible to determine either the position or the momentum of the fat lady at any given time. A show that can't find its natural resolution if anyone is there to see it. People left the theater in tears every night. What about the cat in the box? Was the cat in the box okay? He got the job when someone happened to be in England to see his Cambridge University physics department production of The Pirates of Penzance, starring Professor Stephen Hawking as the Pirate King. The singing wasn't great, but the choreography was innovative. And before you judge me for that joke, let me just say, Professor Hawking himself has heard me do that joke, and he tells me I'm a very funny man. Although, in fairness, it's impossible to tell when he's being sarcastic. My point is, my father is not an idiot. But on this particular trip, the MIT Media Lab had turned around to this thing. He said, "Dylan, I've been listening to," it was a self-help program on CDs that he was listening to. He said, I don't know, it's the sound of ocean waves and nature sound, but underneath there, I don't know what they're saying, but I have never felt better in my life. This is the best program in the world. You must buy the whole set. You must buy the whole set. So I bought them so I wouldn't hurt his feelings. And I listened to them every night when I slept for about 5 years, and I have no idea exactly how they work. But I have to tell you, I never felt better in my life. It is the best program in the world. You must buy the whole set. You must buy the whole set. When I was a child, we lived in Schuylerville, New York, way upstate in New York State. To give you a sense of what kind of town this was, we moved in, I was 4 years old when we moved into the town, and I was just developing my reading skills enough so that as we drove in, I was able to read the sign that said, "Welcome to Schuylerville, population 954. And that afternoon, because we had moved in, the old white-haired mayor himself drove out to the sign with a bucket o' paint and in a Norman Rockwell gesture of welcoming amended it to say, "And some Jews." My dad, at that time, the Vietnam War was still going on, and my father would take me and my mom and my sister to the peace marches in Saratoga Springs, sometimes all the way out in Albany. We would go to these peace marches. He had this special set of running shoes that he had bought just for that purpose, and he wore them to all these peace marches. And I learned as a child this real sense of the power of humanity to change the world and the direction of government. And then I went away to prep school. In my junior year, Ronald Reagan was elected president. And I was all freaked out because these people that I knew and liked were very excited about it, and I thought this was a horrible thing. And I called my dad on the payphone in the basement of my dorm, and I said, "Dad, what's going to these people not realize that this avuncular moron with the blush is the guy who, as president of the Screen Actors Guild, said to the House Un-American Activities Committee, oh, you want a list? Let me get a pen." And my father said, "Relax, Dylan, breathe, it's okay. There is a pendulaic nature to these things. We've had the White House for 4 years. We took down a Republican president in a way that was incredibly embarrassing to the right. Let them have it. We'll get it back. Things will shift back to the left. Breathe." And I took his word for it. And I finished high school and I began doing stand-up comedy. And then Ronald Reagan was reelected. And I called my father and I said, "Are you kidding me?" And he said, "Breathe. It's fine. Pendulaic nature of these things. 2 terms is the norm, 1 term is the anomaly. Everything's going to be okay." And I traveled around New York State and then in London and then up and down the eastern seaboard, taking off my jacket and doing 4-to-1 laugh per minute ratio jokes, taking down the administration as hard as I could, until eventually I moved to Los Angeles. And then his vice president, George H.W. Bush, and I called my father and I said, "Do they not know this is the guy who was he used to be the head of the CIA, he ran the Iran-Contra deal, are you kidding me?" And my father said, "Breathe. Pendulaic nature to these things, we'll get it back, everything will be okay." And 4 years later, Clinton was elected and I thought everything was going to be fine. And it wasn't changing, things weren't changing, it still felt as then Clinton turned out to be far more capitalist than I was comfortable with and far more centrist than I wanted him to be, and nothing was changing. And then after 8 years of that, we elected George W. Bush, and I called my father and I said, "Are you kidding me? Do they not realize this is the man we thought Dan Quayle was?" And my father said, "Relax, breathe, pendulaic nature to things, things change, we'll get it back." And then I was all over the country taking off my jacket and screaming into the microphone as hard as I could, 4-to-1 laugh per minute ratio jokes to make my points, and it was going okay. And then we elected Barack Obama and I thought everything is going to be fine. And I put my jacket back on, and I shifted to the world of storytelling and writing. And then last year we had this election, And I called my father. And I said, Dad, I need your solace and your comfort and your wisdom. And he said, Dylan, we're screwed. So I feel, if you'll just indulge me for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, it occurs to me now that we've entered the Dunning-Kruger era of American politics. Dunning-Kruger, as you are probably aware, is the effect that causes the least competent, least intelligent people to believe they are the most competent and the most intelligent because they are unable to assess their own abilities, not, as our current president believes, one of those one-cup coffee makers that hates Sean Hannity. Now, we elected this moron, and I say moron, I'm not quite certain he falls that high on the scale. If brains were pork, this man would be kosher. We put into the highest office of the land, and I swear to you, if brains were gasoline, he could not pilot a moped halfway around a Fruit Loop. And yet, installed him in the highest office in the land, and I didn't realize just how surreal and demented it was until Inauguration Day, when his spokesperson, Kellyanne Conway, showed up in a bizarre fetishistic Flag Day cosplay outfit and marched around as though she did not know she looked like an idiot. And I know people will say, oh, you can't be sexist, you can't attack Kellyanne Conway on her appearance, but no, I'm not sexist, I am just judgmental, because I also think the president dresses like an idiot. If you are the president of the United States, you ought to have someone around who can tell you that if you are 80 pounds overweight, you don't solve that by wearing a suit that is 5 sizes too big. That doesn't make you look thin, it makes you look like a disgruntled associate professor at a community college. The reason the bottom button of my vest is undone right now is because many, many years ago, people were afraid that Edward VII would be self-conscious about his weight. So does this mean we now all have to start wearing our ties down to our scrota to keep our president comfortable with his bad fashion choices? Ladies and gentlemen, it is not a good time in American politics. This is all I'm saying. Mike Pence, the vice president, if we get rid of the hideous man, if we knock the swirly top clown out of office, we wind up with Mike Pence, a creepy evangelical douche nozzle who calls his wife mother. There is nothing more creepy than calling your wife mother. I one time accidentally said my mother when I meant my wife, and it freaked me out so badly that for 6 months I couldn't have sex with either of them. Ladies and gentlemen, Rex Tillerson is now the head of he's the Secretary of State. He's the head of the state, the former CEO of Exxon is our Secretary of State, ladies and gentlemen. If you like what they did with the Valdez, just wait how you see how he steers this ship of state. Head of Education, Betsy DeVos. Betsy DeVos, a woman who during her confirmation hearing was asked whether she would approve of a measure to keep guns out of public schools, said they might need guns in public schools in case of grizzly bears. I am not making this up. She felt we should have guns in if we have grizzly bears roaming the halls of our grade schools, we have bigger problems than the Second Amendment rights. Grizzly bears, you don't solve that with a gun, you solve that with a door that latches. Let's go with the 16th century gravity-driven technology on this particular issue. Bears, it's an ugly, ugly argument because you can use it for anything and there's no way anyone can really come back against you. I don't want prayer in my schools either. Well, if there are grizzly bears in there, you're going to want prayer, aren't you? If there are grizzly bears in my schools, I will tell you right now, ladies and gentlemen, I do not feel they will be less dangerous if they have access to guns. A woman who feels that the way to do away with abortion in the country is to take sex ed out of our educational system. That's like trying to eliminate graffiti by removing spelling from the schools. She keeps saying we have to go back to a time when prayer was allowed in our schools. There was no time. That's a made-up time. We don't need prayer. I'll tell you what, you can have 5 minutes of prayer in my schools. You can have prayer in my schools if I can put algebra in your churches. How does that work for you? Every time you find a quadratic equation in the New Testament, you can have 5 minutes of prayer in my schools. Every time this Sunday, your priest, your minister, whatever you call your celibate rabbi substitute, every time this Sunday, he works into his little speech to say, you feel that warmth in your heart, that light, and that knowledge that y equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Sure, 5 minutes of prayer in my case. Who knew that so much of the nation would look at the most qualified, competent candidate ever to run for president and say, well, yes, she knows what she's doing. But if there were an emergency in the middle of the night, there she'd be without a penis. It was heartbreaking for me to see it happen. I planned to spend that night celebrating like there was a cure for AIDS and I owned the patent. Instead, as I watched the results came in, I spent the night disguising my attic door as a bookcase. And I was heartbroken. My mood was spiraling downward like Larry Flint at the Guggenheim over the next several months. My favorite thing about that joke is the image of Larry Flint trying to look at the art. My father called me on Inauguration Day. And he said, listen, I know you called me after the election and you wanted comfort and I could not provide it. He said, I figured I should tell you. Went out this morning. Bought a new pair of running shoes. So thank you for that applause. And applause is the best every single audience can have. So I headed down to New York to hear my sister speak at Columbia University. I was staying downtown with a woman, a groupie. Oh God, she was wonderful. When she was approaching orgasm, she said, I'm fixing to come, which was just adorable and useful information. That's a thing. Let me just say this to women in the audience. We like to have that information. We like to know when that's going to happen, and when it is happening, and when it has happened. We like to know what's going. We like to know what's going on, and we want to make it good. We want you to have a good time with us in bed, so that you'll come back. And we don't know what we're doing, really. There's no pamphlet that they hand us in 9th grade that tells us how to make it work. It's not. And I'll be honest, I'm at the point in my marriage at which one of us suggests sex and the other one states what time it is. It's 5:30 in the afternoon. It's 9 o'clock already. Last anniversary, we just traded watches and said, can we stop having this conversation? But, at the beginning of it, when it's good, we want it to be so good for you, and we don't know what we're doing. Like, my wife, she does all the right stuff. She hugs and shudders and giggles and squeals and bites and sighs and scratches and moans and shivers and grips and does the little thing, but it's not all at the same time. And I don't know which one is it. We want the big O, we're getting A through N, and then the rest of the alphabet, and then Greek numerals and Roman. We don't know. Yeah, I remember being in bed every night thinking, what are we now, baby, going into the spin cycle? Let me know when it's time to pull it out and dry it. This was a small enough load, I could have done it by hand. Thank you all for joining me on the Bataan Death March to a stupid little dick joke. I appreciate that. I'll be honest, I got like tops 2, maybe 3 shades of gray. Ultimately, sex with me at this point is just like the world's stupidest escape room puzzle. You do the 3 things, you do them in the same order, and then the little victory song plays, and I'm out. In any case, I was staying with this woman downtown, but then I went uptown. I was going to hear my sister speak. Let me just set the stage for you. Mid-'80s. Nancy Reagan had put together this thing called the Just Say No campaign, based on the idea that the best way to solve a nationwide problem with drug abuse is through a generalized slogan of negativity. Trying to cure addiction with just say no is, to my mind, very much like trying to cure clinical depression with just cheer up. Nancy Reagan, a woman who was known to do between 4 and 14 Valium a day. So clearly the campaign should have been just say no. And Ronald Reagan had a welfare reform proposal that was based on the concept that the best way to discourage people from being poor was to take away their money. Now, my sister was speaking about this welfare reform proposal at Columbia University. She took this very personal. I should explain. My sister is gay. I love her like a brother. And she is the single mother of a beautiful daughter who was deliberately conceived in a loving act between my sister and a turkey baster that was briefly filled with mail-ordered sperm. Just one of the reasons I will not do Thanksgiving dinner at my sister's place. Mom, get that out of the butter. You don't know where it's been. We just had this conversation 20 minutes ago. My sister was briefly on government assistance, not because she is a slacker, not because she is a drain on society, but because she had been caught breastfeeding her infant in the back room at the bar where she went. On a break. And it's an establishment that proudly displays posters of the Coors Girls. Because we live in a bizarre society where it's okay to use breasts to sell beer, but not to feed children. It's a funny story, I hope. The second time I went to see my sister speak, a few years later, George H.W. Bush, his welfare proposal was based on the marriage incentive, based on the concept that the best way to instill in a woman a sense of financial responsibility and independence is through a state-mandated marriage of fiduciary convenience. And my sister was speaking then down at NYU, which is downtown, and I happened to be on the East Coast. I didn't make a special trip for it for this one, but I happened to be there. So I went down to see her on Halloween night at NYU. So I wound up in the Village, in Greenwich Village in New York City on Halloween night with about an hour and a half to kill before my sister was going to speak. And if you ever feel a little bit out of the mainstream, a little bit to the right or to the left of normalcy, just spend Halloween night in Greenwich Village in New York City. It is fantastic. It is a festival of fabulous. People are everywhere, dressed in their happiest fantasies. You'll see men who have been out of the closet for decades, who have found deeper, darker closets with new wardrobe to pull out and try on. I remember at one point coming out of a comic book store and almost bumping into cross-dressed Bo Peep with the blue crinoline and the thigh-high white stockings, and I had this moment where it was a pretty woman and I was about to start flirting, but then whatever kernel of innate homophobia exists in me realized that there was an Adam's apple and a little bit of stubble, and I felt my pelvis pull back, and then I was afraid she was going to see this moment of internal conflict, and I didn't want that to be the whole exchange. So I said, well, you are pretty enough to confuse a straight man. And she saw everything that was going on, and she said, well, aren't you sweet? And she walked on down the street, and I imagined a world in which we are all brave enough to dress as who we want to be and stand beneath a halogen bright street lamp and scream the names of our darkest, most secret demons. And I'm thinking about all of this, and I'm standing waiting for a light to change so I can cross a street. And standing next to me, there was a leather couple. A young leather boy slave and he was wearing a leather vest and I can only describe it as a suede scrotal sling. and then his master was wearing like a cop's hat and a vest and ass chaps, and I could tell he was the master because he was holding the leash. And I smiled at them, realizing that we live in a wonderful world where if you wait long enough and you're open enough to the possibilities, anyone can find someone to love who will love you back for exactly who you are and who you wish to be. And as we shared this moment, another couple came past us, dancing, frolicking up the street perpendicular to us. They were dressed as sperm for the holiday. They were wearing white leotards and tights, and they had long toilet paper tails that spiraled out behind them like the ribbons of their lives. And in case we couldn't tell what they were singing as they went, "Sperm, glorious sperm." I don't know their whole song. "Hot jizz in my mustache," whatever it was. On they went uptown. And the leather boy slave turned to his leather boy master and said, "Freaks." It occurred to me that we live in a wonderful world where if you wait long enough and you're open enough to the possibilities, anyone can find somebody to judge harshly for their decisions. But that's not the time I was going to tell you when I went to see my sister speak. I went to see my sister speak. Reagan administration, Columbia University. And I came out of the lecture hall. And I walked off the Columbia campus way up north on the island of Manhattan into Harlem to take a bus back downtown to where I was staying. And this is when I was a victim of the world's stupidest mugging. The story with which I would like to start tonight's set. It was late December, very cold. I was sitting on a bus bench. My breath steamed in the night air. A large African-American man came out of the building behind me, and well, it was the mid-'80s, so it was still a big black guy. And for the record, that is not an ironic, self-loathing joke about how everyone's too politically correct. That is an ironic, self-loathing joke about how I take great pains to be politically correct for the appropriate era. He sat down next to me. We sat together, waiting for the bus. Our breath steamed in the night air. And after about 5 minutes, he said, "Give me all your money." I said, "What?" He said, "I'm mugging you." I said, "Do you have a knife or something?" Like now we're playing Let's Make a Deal. "Do you have a hard-boiled egg?" He said, "If you want, I could go in and get a knife." I did not want that. So I gave him the $6 that I had in my pocket. And then we sat together, waiting for the bus, with our breath steaming in the night air. After a few minutes, he lit a joint, took a hit, offered it to me. I accepted. I was kind of shaken up. I had just been mugged. After another minute or two, I realized there was a problem, and I said, "Well, now I can't get on the bus." And he said, "Oh, sorry." And handed back $1, which was at the time the cost of a bus ride on the island of Manhattan. And I accepted the $1 and said thank you to my mugger. And we sat together waiting for the bus, with our breath steaming in the night air, until the bus came. Empty bus, morbidly obese driver. As I got on, I thought about saying, "Hey, this guy just mugged me." I am so glad she left. Could you guys feel the way she's been bringing down the energy in the whole room? thought I was saying, hey, this guy, but no, he'd taken $5. It was $5 he'd taken, so it felt less like reporting a crime than telling on a guy. So I just fed my dollar into the machine and got on the bus and found a seat. My mugger got on behind me, fed a dollar into the machine, found a seat a few rows behind me. We rode on into the New York night. After we got a few blocks, he tapped me on the shoulder. I said, "What?" He held out 2 of the remaining $4. He said, "Well, why don't you take half of this money back? You really always ought to have some cash on you." That seemed sensible. So I accepted the $2. And again, I said, "Thank you," to my mugger. We rode on. After a few more blocks, he rang the bell. He rang the bell and he shouted the news to the bus driver, because that's what you do in New York City. That's not what you do. I have come to tell you the story of the world's stupidest mugging, and I have brought a basket of obsolete man. He rang the bell, and then he made a phone call, did some gardening. He flew in from the coast. He pulled the cord that rings the bell and tells the bus driver that he wanted to get off. And as we pulled over to the curb, he tapped me on the shoulder. I said, "What?" And he held out the last of the money. "Why don't you take the rest of this back? I really just needed bus fare." And it occurred to me for the first time that we live in a bizarre society where it's less humiliating to be a criminal than a little short on cash. But by now I felt like I had bonded with my mugger. So I pushed the $2 back into his hand and said, "Well, why don't you hang on to that? You really always ought to have some cash on you." And he said, "Thanks." Got off the bus. We pulled away from the curb. Apparently, the bus driver had caught the tail end of this conversation. Apparently, she was a Reagan Republican. As we drove on into the New York night, she glanced back at me and said, "You know, you really shouldn't give them poor people money. It only encourages them." Dylan Brody, thank you all very much for coming.